Sagittarius. The memory she folded back into light. What if the past doesn't really disappear? It simply waits for the exact moment you are finally brave enough to meet it. There are evenings, Sagittarius, when the light falls a certain way and something inside you shifts, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a memory taking its first step back toward you. You don't call it. You don't expect it. Yet there it is, walking through the half-open door of your heart as if it was never gone. And before you know it, you're standing in a room that feels more like a scene from an old film than real life. Dust dancing in a beam of late afternoon sunlight, the gentle hum of a house settling into silence, the weight of a day you haven't fully understood yet. This is where we meet Amelia. A woman of 45, steady but tired, capable but stretched thin, loved yet quietly lonely in ways she doesn't often name out loud. An office worker whose salary covers life but not dreams. A mother of two who has given more than she has ever received. A woman who has carried responsibilities like invisible stones in her pockets, small, necessary, and heavy in their own persistent way. And on this ordinary afternoon, while sorting through boxes she had promised herself to tidy months ago, Amelia finds a thin notebook with a soft blue cover. A journal. Her journal. The one she wrote when she was 20. The age when the world felt endlessly open. When every future seemed possible. When her heart was full of bright, unedited dreams. She hesitates for a moment, as if touching something sacred. Then she opens it. And suddenly the room shifts. Time softens. The past unfurls like a quiet wave returning to shore. Because inside those pages is a version of her she thought she had left behind. The tender, luminous, fiercely alive girl who believed she would write books, see new countries, fall in love with life before falling in love with anyone else. A young Sagittarius soul with a compass pointed toward freedom, adventure, and meaning. But this is not a story about regret. It is a story about the courage to look at your life without flinching. About realizing what you have lost, yes, but more importantly, what you have carried all along without realizing it. About folding a memory gently, not to erase it, but to honor it. So Sagittarius, come with me. Step into Amelia's quiet, cinematic moment. Let's walk with her as she meets the younger self she never truly abandoned, and discovers what it means at 45, to be free in a way she couldn't at 20. Map 1. The faces she thought she had forgotten the afternoon wrapped in dust and light. The house was unusually quiet that Saturday. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the stillness that happens when life has been moving too fast and suddenly forces you to pause. Amelia stood in the middle of her living room, hair tied loosely, an old t-shirt smudged with a dot of paint from a project she never finished. Sunlight poured through the window in golden stripes, illuminating the floating dust she stirred with each step. The boxes around her were labeled with years she didn't want to remember. 2012, kids' old clothes, college stuff, and one unmarked, the cardboard slightly caved in from too many moves and too little care. She didn't plan to open it. She only wanted to clear space, make room, feel less cluttered in a life that already felt like an overfilled drawer. But something about the box called to her. Maybe it was the way the light hit it. Maybe it was the way her breath caught, just slightly, when she touched its worn edges. She lifted the lid, expecting old bills, maybe outdated documents. Instead, she found a stack of small objects that didn't belong to any particular chapter of her current life. A dried flower pressed between wax paper, a photo of her at a train station she barely remembered being at, a keychain shaped like a star. And beneath them, a slender notebook with a faded blue cover, its spine softened by time, its corners rounded as if handled by younger, gentler hands. The notebook that opened the door. Amelia froze. For a moment she didn't breathe. She knew that notebook, not by memory but by instinct, the way you recognize your own reflection even after many years of avoiding mirrors. She sat on the floor, cross-legged like she used to sit when she was young, and let her fingers glide over the cover. Something inside her chest tightened, not painfully, just enough to remind her she had a heart full of stories that had never been told. When she opened the notebook, a faint scent rose from the pages, paper mixed with thyme and a hint of vanilla lotion she used when she was 20. The handwriting was hers but softer, rounder, more hopeful. On the first page, a sentence was written in big, bold letters. I will not let adulthood make me ordinary. She felt a small, involuntary laugh escape her lips, part tenderness, part ache. That girl, that version of herself, had believed it with her whole being. And here she was at 45, surrounded by overdue bills, children's toys scattered under the couch, a sink full of dishes waiting for her, and a job that paid just enough to cover necessities but never dreams. She turned the pages slowly, like touching something fragile. There were lists of dreams: travel to Italy, write a book before 30, learn French, start a small photography studio. Tucked between 2 pages was a tiny train ticket dated July 7, 2000. When she held it up, the memory surged. She had taken that train alone, her heart beating wildly with the belief she was stepping into the life she wanted. She hadn't realized then that dreams don't disappear. They simply shift when life demands it. The girl at 20 standing in the room. As she read, Amelia could almost see the younger version of herself sitting across from her. Bright eyes, messy ponytail, a camera hanging from her neck, and that unmistakable Sagittarius spark that made her believe the world was hers to explore. She remembered how fearless she had been, how easily she laughed, how she never doubted the universe had a place carved out specifically for her. She remembered the afternoons when she wandered through bookstores imagining her name on the spine of a novel. She remembered biking through the city at sunset, wind tangling her hair, whispering promises to herself about the life she would build. And now, in this quiet living room, the present Amelia felt both close to and painfully distant from that past self. It wasn't regret. It was more like a bittersweet recognition of a friend she had once loved deeply but lost touch with. She traced the ink where her younger self had written a line she once lived by. "I want a life that feels like I chose it, not one that happened to me." The words landed heavily, not as a wound, but as a truth she had forgotten she once trusted. The soft ache of what might have been. A wave of tenderness washed through her. Not sadness, something calmer, something older. She didn't hate her current life. She loved her children fiercely, loved the quiet evenings when they leaned against her on the couch, loved the small routines that stitched her days together. But she also couldn't ignore the gap between the girl who believed everything was possible and the woman who now calculated grocery budgets with careful precision. Still, as she held the notebook, she realized something unexpected. She didn't feel ashamed of who she had become. Tired, yes. Stretched thin, absolutely. But ashamed? No. In fact, she felt a strange pride in the woman who had made it this far without applause, without guidance, without anyone noticing how hard she fought for the simple, ordinary stability she now had. Maybe her life wasn't extraordinary in the way she once imagined, but maybe surviving, enduring, giving, and loving quietly was a different kind of extraordinary. One her 20-year-old self had not yet understood. The sunlight shifted, landing on the notebook like a spotlight on a forgotten artifact. Amelia closed it gently, holding it to her chest for a long moment. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She simply breathed deeply, slowly, as if anchoring herself between 2 timelines. The past had walked toward her softly, and she, for the first time in years, didn't run from it. Map 2. The colors her memory never let go when the pages became windows. That night, after the children had fallen asleep and the house settled into its usual, comfortable stillness, Amelia returned to the notebook as if something inside it had called her back. She curled into the corner of the old sofa, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background, a blanket draped over her legs. The lamp beside her cast a warm, amber glow that softened the edges of the room, making everything feel slightly dreamlike. She opened the journal to a page filled with doodles, stars, arrows, little phrases written in a rush of excitement only a 20-year-old heart could understand. The words seemed almost too young for her now, yet strangely familiar, like a melody she hadn't heard in decades but still knew the rhythm of. As she read, the boundaries between then and now blurred. She could almost hear her own laughter from the past, lighter, freer, untouched by deadlines, bills, and the heavy everyday logistics of adulthood. The pages weren't just paper. They were windows she could look through, revealing colors she had forgotten her life once held. The tender conversation across time. There was an entry written after her first solo trip, scribbled at 2 a.m., the handwriting wobbly from exhaustion and joy. "I feel like the world is so big and so kind tonight. I want to spend my life chasing sunsets and conversations." Amelia touched the ink with her fingertip, as if the younger her were still there, whispering truths she no longer lived by. She remembered that night, the train ride, the quiet countryside rolling past the window, the feeling that she was becoming someone new with every mile. Her chest tightened with a soft ache, and she found herself speaking into the empty room, half smiling at the absurdity, half surrendering to the intimacy of the moment. "I'm sorry I didn't keep all your promises." The room felt gentler in response, as though the shadows were listening. But something inside her, quiet, steady, rose to challenge her apology. An older, wiser voice that had learned through years of survival. "Or maybe you kept the ones that mattered." It was strange, this dialogue with herself. But she sensed that both versions of her were right. The 20-year-old had dreamed of passion and endless discovery. The 45-year-old had fought for stability, love, and a home that felt safe. They weren't contradictions, just different shades of a life lived honestly, with the tools she had at the time. Little things that felt like signs. As she turned more pages, small relics slipped out. Tiny breadcrumbs from a younger life. A dried leaf she picked up from a park during a picnic with friends. A photo of her standing on a rooftop with the sunset behind her. A poem she copied from a book because she believed it described her destiny. But one small Polaroid made her pause. It was a picture of her sitting on a windowsill, sunlight pouring over her face. She must have been 21. She wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but there was something radiant in her expression. Something unguarded, full of raw possibility. Her younger self wasn't posing. She was simply existing, caught in a moment of honesty. Amelia held the photo closer, as if examining the eyes. "What were you thinking?" she whispered. But she already knew. She remembered that day clearly, the way she had written in her journal. "One day, I'll live a life that feels like this sunlight." For a moment, Amelia wondered if fate had tried to send her hints all along. Not in dramatic, life-changing ways but in quiet invitations, like the journal resurfacing, the Polaroid slipping into her lap, the whisper of memories returning just when she needed them. These weren't coincidences, they were reminders. Signs that life, even when it feels dim, has pockets of light waiting to be noticed. When hope becomes a mirage, a soft insight began to settle in her chest. She realized that reading these entries wasn't just nostalgia. It was projection. Her 20-year-old self had dreamed vividly, and in loneliness or overwhelm, Amelia sometimes painted that girl as the version of herself who should have been. The successful one. The courageous one. The one who didn't settle. But as she sat there with the journal open on her lap, a subtle truth rose like dawn. She wasn't missing out on the life she wanted. She had simply built a different life than the one she imagined. And that didn't make it lesser. Just different. The insight was gentle, not harsh. As Sagittarius, she had always idealized the potential of things. People, dreams, even her own past. Hope was her compass, sometimes her anchor, sometimes her illusion. She realized how often she had painted her past brighter than it really was, turning it into a version she could never compete with. But that was the trap. The past is always easier to romanticize because it's no longer asking anything from us. The present demands effort, resilience, truth. And truth, she knew, was something Sagittarius often avoided until it cornered her softly, like tonight. The quiet shift in her chest. By the time she closed the journal, the lamp had grown warmer, the blanket heavier around her legs, and a new stillness had formed inside her. Not regret, not longing, but a soft-hearted acknowledgement. She wasn't just revisiting her youth. She was reconciling with it. The memories didn't sting the way she expected. Instead, they wrapped around her like a familiar melody, reminding her that she had once been brave enough to dream, and that maybe in quieter ways she still was. As she ran her hand over the notebook one last time, she felt something inside her settle. She could honor her past without living inside it. She could be grateful for the girl she had been without resenting the woman she had become. The colors of her memory didn't fade. They simply blended into who she was now. And somewhere deep within her, the younger Amelia smiled, not with reproach but with recognition. Map 3. Where the truth softly reveals itself, the evening that asked her a question. The next night, after the children had drifted into sleep and the house dimmed into its usual cocoon of shadows, Amelia found herself drawn once again to the blue notebook. She didn't plan to read it. She didn't even open it. She simply held it in her hands while sitting at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the overhead light buzzing faintly like an old memory trying to speak. A cup of tea steamed gently beside her, untouched, cooling as the minutes passed. The air felt different tonight. Heavier, quieter, almost expectant. As if life had paused just long enough for her to hear something she had been avoiding for years. She opened the notebook to a random page and her breath caught. It was an entry from her 20-year-old self, written in confident strokes. I promise myself I will never become someone who lives life out of fear. I will not choose the safe path over the meaningful one. For a moment, Amelia felt like she was staring at a stranger. Or worse, an accuser. Her shoulders tensed and she looked away, suddenly aware of the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a clock she'd never noticed, the silence pressing in from every wall. She tried to breathe, but the words lingered like a gentle, painful echo. Promise myself. She hadn't thought about promises in years. Survival didn't leave space for declarations. Yet here it was, a vow she once made with her whole unbroken heart, staring at her like a reflection she wasn't ready to face. The moment the mirror tilts. She read the entry again, slower this time, tracing the curves of the letters. And as she did, the truth began to appear. Not sudden, not sharp, but like a fog lifting at dawn. She realized she had not betrayed her younger self, not in the way she had feared. She had simply lived a different truth than the one she imagined at 20. But when she first read the sentence, her mind did something it had always done. It compared. The girl who vowed to conquer the world versus the woman who managed grocery budgets and credit card minimums. The girl who wanted to write novels versus the woman who typed reports under fluorescent office lights. The girl who felt limitless versus the woman who felt tired. This comparison, silent, relentless, had lived inside her for years. But tonight the mirror tilted. And she saw something she had never allowed herself to see before. That choosing the safe path wasn't cowardice. Sometimes it was courage in a different shape. Sometimes the meaningful choice is not the wild one, but the steady one. The one that keeps food on the table, keeps children warm, keeps a family standing even when the world pulls at every seam. The truth she never named. She turned a few pages further and found a passage written on her 20th birthday. I hope I never lose the fire inside me. I hope the world doesn't put it out. Amelia exhaled, a soft sound edged with something between relief and sorrow. She whispered into the stillness. It didn't go out. It just changed. And saying it felt like telling the truth for the first time. She had always believed she let life happen to her. That she drifted into a version of herself she never intended to become. But as she sat with the journal in her hands, she saw her life differently. She saw the years she spent holding everything together alone. The nights she stayed awake with sick children while her own body ached from exhaustion. The days she went to work even when her heart felt like a collapsing tent. The choices she made, not out of fear but out of love. Out of duty. Out of necessity. Her younger self didn't know the weight of responsibility. She didn't know how love could be both anchor and burden. She didn't know that meaningful might look like sacrifice, not adventure. The subtle distance between two selves. Amelia closed the journal halfway, staring into the dim kitchen light as if seeking a doorway into understanding. She realized how little she truly knew about the woman she had become. She had been so busy judging herself for abandoning youthful dreams that she never noticed the quiet strength she had cultivated in their place. The distance between her 20-year-old self and her 45-year-old self was not betrayal. It was evolution. Yet as she examined this truth, another softer ache revealed itself. She had been lonely for a very long time. Not for romance or companionship, but for herself, for the version of her who felt alive, hopeful, imaginative. She whispered, "Where did you go?" And in the stillness another truth whispered back. One that felt both tender and painful. "I never left. You just stopped looking." It wasn't a dramatic moment. No tears. No awakenings that shattered the air. It was quiet, achingly quiet. Like watching a slow-motion scene in a film where the character doesn't break, but finally understands where the wound came from. When the truth becomes a soft landing. She closed the notebook gently, fingertips lingering on the worn cover as if touching the hand of someone she once loved. And she realized, she had never truly known her younger self, not in the way she idealized her. She remembered her as brave, carefree, unstoppable. But that girl had been scared too. She had been uncertain, insecure, overwhelmed by the bigness of her own dreams. She wasn't a flawless icon, she was simply young. Amelia lowered her head for a moment, letting the truth settle. She hadn't lost her courage. She had simply learned to carry it differently. Instead of fire, it had become warmth. Instead of adventure, it had become endurance. Instead of wild beginnings, it had become quiet survivals. And whether she admitted it or not, that was still a kind of bravery. When she finally stood, stretching her tired limbs and switching off the kitchen light, something inside her felt subtly aligned. Not healed. Not resolved. Just honest. The truth had revealed itself. Not loudly, not harshly, but gently. Like a hand on her shoulder. Like a version of herself saying, "You did what you had to. And I'm proud of you." Map 4. When the heart begins to write its own story, the quiet before the realization. The next morning the house stirred awake in its usual rhythm. Children arguing lightly over cereal choices, the kettle whistling, the radio playing a soft tune meant to energize a tired household. Life felt ordinary again, almost deceptively so. But inside Amelia something had shifted. A softness. A steadiness. A sense that the past night had opened a door she hadn't even known she was standing in front of. While packing school lunches, she found herself glancing at the blue notebook resting on the counter. Not with longing this time, but with a quiet acknowledgement. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The truth had already been absorbed into her bloodstream. Yet as she moved through her morning, another layer of understanding began to unfold. An introspection she had never allowed herself to articulate. Why Sagittarius paints people, and themselves, in light. Sagittarius hearts, like Amelia's, have a deep talent for painting things brighter than they are. It isn't delusion. It's survival. It's hope disguised as vision. When she was 20, Amelia saw the world through a lens of possibility. She loved potential, the shimmering outline of what could be. And Sagittarius, by nature, often falls in love with potential more than reality. The potential of people, of dreams, of their own future selves. It wasn't that Amelia refused to see the truth. It was that she preferred the light. She preferred the fire of what might be over the shadow of what was. She projected her hopes onto the future until the future became too heavy to hold. And when adulthood arrived, with its bills, responsibilities, and quiet sacrifices, she didn't mourn the loss of dreams. She mourned the loss of the version of herself who dared to believe in them without hesitation. Idealization wasn't a flaw. It was a coping mechanism, a compass that pointed toward meaning, even when life gave her none. The psychology beneath her longing. As she washed dishes, her mind drifted through layers she had previously avoided. There were reasons she clung to the memory of her younger self. Reasons she felt the sharp pull of nostalgia whenever life became heavy. She realized she wasn't longing for youth. She was longing for who she felt like when she was young. And there is a difference. At 20 she felt alive, spacious, untethered. She believed she could choose her path. At 45 she often felt chosen by her circumstances instead. The psychology of it was simple but profound. When life becomes too structured, the heart mourns freedom. When responsibility becomes constant, the mind mourns innocence. Her nostalgia wasn't about regret. It was about identity. A part of her wondered whether she had abandoned her earlier self, left that brave, hopeful girl in an old notebook to gather dust. But another part of her, the part that had survived heartbreaks, pregnancies, layoffs, and exhaustion, whispered the deeper truth. You never abandoned her. You carried her. Just differently. Less loudly. Less boldly. But carried her still. The inner mechanism she never saw. As she sat at the edge of her bed later that evening, she allowed herself to look inward with honesty, not judgment. She saw the mechanisms that had guided her for years without her noticing. Loneliness, she filled the silence with memories of the girl she once was, because that girl felt more vivid than her current exhaustion. Hope, she exaggerated the brightness of her past to remind herself she still had light inside her, even when life felt dim. Responsibility, she abandoned dreams not because she was weak, but because she was needed elsewhere. Fear of disappointment, she stopped pursuing certain goals not because she lost faith, but because she couldn't afford to fail, not when others relied on her. And beneath all of it lay a deeper truth Sagittarius rarely admits. Sometimes we choose nostalgia because reality feels too heavy to carry alone. Amelia exhaled, slow and long, as though releasing decades of self-blame. The notebook hadn't shown her what she lost. It had shown her what she protected. Mirror psychology, a question for the listener. If you are listening, Sagittarius, allow this moment to reflect quietly back to you. How many times have you believed you failed your younger self, when in truth you were saving her? How often have you compared your life to the potential you once envisioned, without realizing the weight you carried along the way? How many times have you mourned a dream that wasn't abandoned, just postponed until you had enough space, enough breath, enough safety to return to it? Sagittarius rarely looks at herself with gentleness. You see everything through contrast, what you wanted versus what is. But the gap isn't failure. It's growth. It's the story of a heart that kept going even when the path became narrow. When analysis becomes healing. By nightfall, something inside Amelia softened into truth. Not the harsh truth she had feared, but a compassionate one. She realized her younger self wasn't disappointed in her. She simply wanted to be remembered, to be honored, to be integrated, not idolized or mourned. And the woman she had become didn't need to apologize for her life. She needed to acknowledge that she had built a foundation sturdy enough for her younger self's dreams to one day rest upon. The fire hadn't died. It had become embers, quiet, steady, waiting for the right breath to awaken it again. And Amelia, for the first time in decades, felt the warmth of those embers. Not as regret, but as a beginning. Map 5. When Sagittarius steps out of her own story, folding the memory with gentle hands. On Sunday afternoon, sunlight spilled across the kitchen table where the blue notebook rested. Quiet, patient, almost serene. Amelia stood for a long moment just looking at it. Not with longing this time. Not with ache. But with a kind of affection reserved for something that has finally been understood. She sat down, exhaled slowly, and opened to the first page once more. The handwriting looked younger than ever. Almost childlike. Filled with conviction and innocence. She smiled, really smiled, because she finally saw the girl behind the words. Not the idealized version she had clung to. Not the flawless dreamer she had compared herself to for years. But the real girl. Hopeful, unpolished, unsure. Brave in the only way a 20-year-old knows how to be. She pressed her palm over the page for a moment, as if giving her younger self a quiet blessing. Then she closed the notebook with the gentleness of someone folding a delicate piece of fabric. She didn't close it out of denial or avoidance. She closed it because she no longer needed it to tell her who she should have been. She finally understood who she was. A new kind of freedom. The rest of the afternoon moved in small, tender rhythms, folding laundry, watering plants, cutting fruit for the children. Yet everything felt subtly different, as if a heavy layer had lifted from the air around her. She felt lighter walking across the living room. She felt steadier opening a window to let fresh air in. She felt present, not pulled backward by nostalgia, not pushed forward by expectations, but balanced in the now. It struck her then with unexpected clarity. This was a kind of freedom too. A mature freedom. Not the wild, wind-in-her-hair freedom she once believed defined her Sagittarius spirit, but a quieter version. Freedom from self-judgment. Freedom from old comparisons. Freedom from the pressure to become who she used to dream of. Freedom to simply be who she is. She sat on the balcony as dusk approached, the sky burning with shades of orange and violet. And she realized something profound. She didn't envy her 20-year-old self anymore. Not her idealism. Not her fire. Not her unbroken dreams. Because at 45, she had a wisdom that came from choices, sacrifices, and continuous resilience. A wisdom her younger self could never have imagined. The healing realization. As the evening breeze brushed against her skin, a quiet revelation settled into her chest. She hadn't failed her younger self. She had completed her. Every compromise, every pause, every detour. None of them were betrayals. They were chapters. They were steps that allowed her to grow in ways the 20-year-old version of her had no framework to understand. And the life she lived, modest income, small debts, tired mornings, was not a lesser life. It was a deeply human one. Courageous one. A life built not on uninterrupted dreams, but on love, responsibility, and perseverance. That too was meaningful. That too was Sagittarius' spirit, stretched, tested, transformed, but still burning. She whispered to herself almost as a prayer, "I'm proud of you." And she meant it for both versions of her, past and present. A message to the Sagittarius listening. Sagittarius, this is your moment of mirror psychology. Let Amelia's story reflect something back to you. How long have you punished yourself for dreams you postponed, not realizing you were busy surviving? How many times have you romanticized your past, believing the younger you was braver, when in truth she was simply untested? How often have you forgotten that your present self carries every version of you that has ever lived? Your fire, your fragility, your resilience, your hope. Sagittarius, you are not late. You are not behind. You are not less extraordinary because life asked more of you than you expected. There is a freedom that comes with age, the freedom of clarity, compassion, and self-respect. The freedom to rewrite the meaning of your dreams. The freedom to start again without apology. The freedom to accept that the version of you today is not a diluted form of who you were, but an upgraded one. Wiser, softer, more grounded, still capable of light. Closing the chapter, not the door. Later that night, after a warm shower and the tender chaos of putting kids to bed, Amelia placed the notebook gently into a drawer. Not hidden, not buried. Just set aside like a memory folded neatly. Honored but no longer haunting. She didn't close the door on her past, she simply stopped living inside it. And as she turned off the lights, she felt something rare. Something she hadn't felt in years. She felt whole. She felt enough. She felt like a Sagittarius who had finally returned to her own orbit. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the life she once dreamed of, not as the girl she used to be, but as the woman she finally allowed herself to become.